front page of US President Trump and Melania and President Xi standing in front of the Forbidden Palace in Beijing. The paper is saying Mr. Xi gave his US counterpart a warm welcome at the beginning of the three-day state visit. You can see them all there. That's just shortly after their arrival. Meanwhile, the Financial Times has its own take on this visit, as do many other international newspapers, saying more importantly than the trade deals for the Xi-Trump summit will be the domination of discussions about North Korea and how the US and China can work together to solve the current crisis. Other stories in the papers today, we've got the Telegraph. British MP Priti Patel, of course, who's been forced to resign from the UK government over secret meetings with Israeli politicians. Lots of analysis on that. Also, The Independent. It's looking at how the UK's 100 biggest publicly listed companies have doubled the proportion of positions occupied by women. That's something that's taken place in the last 6 years, so more women on the boards in the UK. And let's show you also a photo on the Hindustan Times website, which shows you the terrible pollution affecting people in Delhi right now, how it could in fact prove deadly after dense fog was blamed for causing a multi-car pileup on the outskirts of the Indian capital. Well, as mentioned before, I'm joined by Rolake Akinkugbe, who's Head of Energy and Natural Resources at FBN Capital. Good to see you again, Rolake. We were talking earlier, weren't we, about that driverless bus. But let's talk about the big story today in news around the world. We just heard President Xi, President Trump addressing the press. China Daily, of course, all over its front page, has a lot of positive language about how important this state visit is.
Yeah, Sally, I think the one thing that must be said, looking at the pictures and the videos, is both presidents seem to be getting on quite well. But obviously the tougher issue here really is North Korea. And Trump didn't mince words, calling for China to sever ties with North Korea. I think that's going to be a tough call. The truth is, China's role in this whole regional geopolitical crisis is quite instrumental to what happens going forward. I think ultimately the real challenge is how you go for deterrence as opposed to outright war. Let's not forget the potential countries in the midst of this, Japan, South Korea. And so I think there's going to be a need to look at the diplomatic angle rather than the grandstanding we've been seeing going on.
I mean, both President Xi and President Trump talked about North Korea. They talked about the fact they discussed it. They talked about the fact that they're seeing a lot of cooperation. Communication is strong. That in itself is a positive, isn't it? We have stepped forward in terms of a diplomatic outcome in terms of that crisis in the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, and I think that's really necessary. And if you look at the China case, China has itself got a lot of flack for North Korea for supporting UN sanctions against Pyongyang over the last few years. So there's a need to pivot away from that position to find an amiable solution, because the truth of the matter is that entire East Asian region, plus the ASEAN countries, a lot of the smaller countries stand to suffer. And then all the other things we can talk about, climate change and trade, get lost in the broader debate around North Korea.
And that's what the Financial Times really points out, doesn't it, in its editorial comment on this trip. So looking at China Daily, which we've mentioned is state-sponsored, of course, that will be one angle on it, but the international press really focused on this key issue. Interesting, though, as well, that in that press conference, they talked about so many other things.
They did.
Some things that I didn't expect, like tackling drug addiction, for example.
Yes, I mean, it just goes to show the potential synergies that exist to boost relations between both countries. China and the US, like it or not, are still both important partners with each other. If you just look at side trade, in terms of both countries' positions in the global economy, and then, of course, on the back of the sidelines of this, you mentioned in your previous report, the GE Electric $3.5 billion deal.
Absolutely. General Electric, what do you make of that? An energy tie-up?
Well, I think there's potential scope for more private sector-led deals between both countries. And of course, a very touchy issue for the Americans is the whole issue of access to Chinese markets for American companies. I think an issue which Trump has obviously been pushing quite strongly. Yeah.
Now let's move on to other stories. The UK press is very focused on Priti Patel and her resignation. Another day, another crisis, says the Daily Telegraph. Of course, this refers to the fact that she's lost 2 cabinet ministers in a week, Damien Green being the other. Give us your take on Theresa May's challenges she's facing right now.
I mean, it's
sorry, Michael Fallon, I've got that wrong.
Well, there was Michael Fallon. We had
Yes,
Michael Fallon.
yes.
Now and in the space of a week, we now have Priti Patel.
Yes,
and there's
that's right.
investigations
Into
going on
Damon
Damon
Green, yeah.
Green.
I'm
And
mixing
more
up my
recently, we
lists.
heard that Boris Johnson had made some comments,
Yeah.
which are also being investigated around this Iranian situation with the journalist. I think obviously it's a major destabilizing issue for the government. The Brexiters obviously saw Priti Patel as a main standard bearer. Now the question is, how is she going to move forward from this? What is her replacement, Priti's replacement, going to look like? And of course, the more pressing issues with the budget due in 13 days, I think she cannot afford this continuous political distraction. And there's
Well, she can't afford it, but it's happening.
well,
That's
it's
the problem.
happening, and so there's a need to focus back on the big issues of the day. And she needs to nip this in the bud, quickly appoint a replacement, because there's a lot of speculation going on. Of course, we know the Israeli issue, the Palestine issue, are very challenging global issues. So it's a very controversial matter, really.
Just quickly, the proportion of women on FTSE 100 boards has more than doubled in 6 years. This follows a real push by the government, actually, to try and make this happen, but also not just the government, other organisations and groups within the City of London, mainly represented by women, to make this happen as well. Encouraging to see, we're seeing progress.
We're seeing progress, encouraging to see. I don't want to be a skeptic, but we also need to look at the absolute numbers. So we saw a 15% growth in board representation, but the key funnel for board representation is really women in senior executive positions. If we don't have women in more senior positions, then we're not going to see more women on boards. And I think there was some review that was done by the World Economic Forum that said the gender pay gap is still a problem even in the UK. If you look at other G20 countries like France and Germany, the UK ranks behind in 15th position. So there's still
So we're
a
going
lot
in
more
reverse in
strides.
some areas, but we're seeing progress
Yeah,
in
but
others.
I mean, a lot has to be said, and we have to applaud the work that the Hampton-Alexander Review Committee has done in this regard. Yeah.
Hindustan Times is looking at the dense fog in India, and of course this is a story we've looked at length on BBC World News as well. It's getting pretty critical. Give us your take on this, being an energy analyst.
As an energy analyst, and I've also just on my way back from Shanghai, right? Shanghai, one of the big cities in China affected, not as badly as Beijing, but New Delhi and India particularly, 4,000 schools have been closed. And we saw November last year, over 1,000 primary schools have closed. I think the World Health Organization is saying the levels we're seeing of pollution, so pollution from car exhausts, from crop burning on farms, and from other types of industrial pollution are 30 times higher than healthy levels. It's a pretty serious situation, and I think one clearly which has health implications, but also environmental and road safety implications clearly. And it feeds into the broader climate change debate, which I think also highlights the need to tackle it head on. Really.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I noticed climate change wasn't mentioned in that speech.
No.
Many things were on the part of President Xi and President Trump, but the climate did not feature. Thank you so much for coming in. So good to have you on the programme. That's Rolake Akinkugbe. Thank you too for your company. That is the briefing. Lots more to come at the top of the hour on BBC News. Stay with us. We'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.
When you've covered the story from every angle, when you've reported the facts, whatever the obstacles, if you've asked the questions others won't, when you've never taken sides in any war, revolution or election, when you've come under fire from people in power,